Welcome, my friend. Tonight, I would like to invite you to journey with me into a place where time seems to pause, and where the whispers of the past still drift across the quiet waters. There are corners of this world where faith leaves an invisible mark, not only on stone and memory, but on the very air we breathe, hidden in the mist and the silence. These stories wait for hearts willing to listen. In this story, we will walk together through a forgotten village, stand beside a silent lake, and witness a light that refuses to be extinguished. It is a story not of fear, but of remembrance, of hope, and of the quiet strength that faith can give even in the darkest nights. If you find beauty in mysteries that touch the soul, and stories that linger like a soft prayer long after the last word is spoken, I warmly invite you to stay with us. And if you feel called to continue walking alongside these journeys of wonder and spirit, you are most welcome to subscribe and join our little circle of listeners. Now, close your eyes just for a moment. Take a breath, let the noise of the world fall away, and together, let us begin. Chapter 1. Whispers Across the Water. The first time I heard about Saint Laura, I was sitting in a cramped newsroom in the heart of Lyon, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee and skimming through half-hearted press releases. My editor, a wiry man named Dumas with a perpetual scowl, slapped the manila folder onto my desk with the urgency of a man tossing a lifeline. "You're wasting away here, Morin," he grumbled. "Get out, find me something that breathes." I raised an eyebrow, thumbing through the folder. It was thin, containing little more than a brief tourist brochure and a yellowed newspaper clipping from decades past. The words, Saint Laura and Candlelight on the Lake, leapt out at me, wrapped in the musty scent of forgotten tales. "A ghost story?" I asked, trying to keep the skepticism from my voice. Dumas shrugged. "A mystery, a relic. I don't care. Just bring me back something people will actually read." That evening, I sat alone in my tiny apartment, the rain tapping an impatient rhythm against the window. I flipped through the sparse materials again. The brochure spoke of a village frozen in time, where cobbled streets remember every footfall and the mist on the lake carries prayers from the past. The newspaper article was more pointed. Every year, on the same night, lights appeared over the lake, hundreds of tiny flames bobbing silently on the water's black surface. No explanation, no proof, just whispers and wonder. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, a place where the past still breathed. It was absurd. It was perfect. Saint Laura revealed itself to me 2 days later, emerging from a veil of morning fog as if reluctant to be seen. The village nestled in a shallow valley, embraced by dark, slumbering woods that wore their centuries like a heavy cloak. Stone cottages leaned against one another like old friends, their shutters weathered and paint peeling but alive with flower boxes and faint trails of smoke curling from crooked chimneys. I pulled my car to a stop at the edge of the main square, if it could be called that. It was little more than a widening of the cobbled lane, circled by a sagging bakery, a dim cafe, and a church that dominated the landscape like a stern patriarch. Its spire clawed at the gray sky, a black cross barely visible through the mist. The air tasted of moss, damp earth, and something older, a memory etched into the stones. I shouldered my bag and stepped out into the square. An elderly man sweeping the front of the cafe offered me a wary glance but said nothing. A dog barked once from somewhere unseen. I made my way to the church, drawn like a moth to the silent monolith. The doors were heavy oak, carved with worn reliefs of saints and angels. I pushed them open with a groan of protest from the hinges and stepped inside. The interior was cool and dim, lit only by the frail fingers of light that managed to pry their way through the narrow stained glass windows. Rows of pews stretched into the shadows, their surfaces polished smooth by centuries of hands and prayers. And there, at the front of the sanctuary, stood a lone candle, an old, thick pillar, flickering beneath a worn crucifix. The flame swayed, though the air was still. I felt the hairs on my arms lift. I took a hesitant step forward, my footsteps absorbed by the thick stone floor. A plaque beneath the crucifix caught my eye, its inscription faded but still legible. To the martyrs of the lake, whose light shall never be extinguished. The echo of those words seemed to ripple outward, as though the walls themselves breathed them. Later, at the cafe, I sipped a bitter coffee and scribbled notes into my leather-bound journal. The locals were tight-lipped, offering little more than sidelong glances and murmured excuses. It was an old story, they said, an old sorrow, best left to itself. But I had learned long ago that silence was just another language, one that often concealed the most precious truths. It was the barkeep, a stout woman named Elise with kind eyes and a spine of iron, who finally broke the spell. "You came for the lights," Elise said, wiping her hands on a towel. I set down my pen. "I did. You won't find answers," Elise warned, her voice low. "Only questions. And maybe," she hesitated, glancing toward the church visible through the grimy window, "maybe a little faith, if you're lucky. Tell me," I urged, "tell me about the lights." Elise pulled up a chair and lowered herself into it with a sigh. "Long ago, before even my grandmother's time," she began, "this village was a refuge. When the soldiers came to purge the faithful, many fled to the woods. Some," her gaze drifted toward the lake, "unseen beyond the mist. Some found sanctuary on the island in the middle of the water." "There was an island," I leaned in. Elise confirmed. "It's gone now, swallowed by the lake after a great storm. But once, it rose like a crown from the mist. They say the faithful would gather there at night, lighting candles and singing hymns to keep their courage." She paused, her eyes distant. "One night, they were found, surrounded. None escaped. The soldiers showed no mercy. But the faithful did not cry out. They only sang louder, until the waters themselves seemed to carry their song." A chill threaded its way down my spine. "And now," I whispered. "Now," Elise said, "on the anniversary of that night, the lake remembers. The candles return. Outside, the mist thickened, coiling like ghostly fingers around the village." I closed my journal and wrapped my hands around the coffee cup. Drawing warmth from it, I stared out the window, my mind racing. A village haunted by memory, a lake that grieved with light. This was not a ghost story, not truly. It was a hymn, and somewhere deep inside me, something long dormant stirred, a flicker of belief, as fragile and stubborn as a flame in the wind. That night, I stood alone on the edge of the lake. The waters were black as polished obsidian, the surface perfectly still, as though it held its breath. The village behind me was silent. Even the trees seemed to bow their heads. I clutched my coat tighter around me. I should have been cold, but the air against my skin felt almost expectant, as if the very world leaned closer, waiting. I stared into the mist that floated low over the water, willing myself to see. Minutes passed. Then, from the darkness, a single point of light bloomed, small, golden, trembling. Another appeared beside it, then another, and another. Within moments, 100 tiny flames dotted the surface of the lake, bobbing gently as though cradled by unseen hands. I felt tears sting my eyes. I could hear nothing, no engines, no whispers, only the solemn, breathtaking silence of the night. And in that silence, I understood the faithful had never truly left. Their prayers lived on, stitched into the fabric of the earth. The air, the water, the lake was not haunted. It was hallowed. When I finally turned away, I did not feel alone. Not anymore. The lights danced on the water behind me, a celestial procession, and somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled, one clear, mournful note that rolled across the hills like a benediction. I smiled through my tears. Tomorrow, I would begin to write, but tonight, I would simply believe. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Stone. The morning after witnessing the candles on the lake, I awoke with a strange heaviness in my chest, not fear. Exactly, but a sense that the world had deepened somehow, as if the veil between past and present had thinned overnight, and now the very air of Saint Laura hummed with memory. The mist clung stubbornly to the streets, swirling around the cobbled lanes and sagging rooftops as I stepped out into the square. The village was beginning to stir, the clatter of a pail, the distant bark of a dog, the low murmur of unseen conversations. But everything remained muted, as if the mist muffled even sound itself. At the cafe, Elise greeted me with a nod and a steaming cup of coffee without a word. It seemed that in Saint Laura, the extraordinary was folded into the everyday, worn like an old coat, comforting, but never spoken of directly. "Father Pierre will see you," she said at last, setting a second cup down for herself. "He tends the church and the memories." I blinked. I didn't ask. Elise smiled, a tired, knowing smile. "You don't have to. The lake chooses its own messengers." The church looked no different in daylight, though somehow even grayer, as if the stones themselves remembered the sorrow carved into them. I climbed the worn steps and hesitated at the heavy doors before pushing them open once again. Inside, the sanctuary was empty, save for a figure kneeling at the front. He was slight, stooped, dressed in plain black robes. His head was bowed, and he murmured prayers that slipped into the air like smoke. I approached quietly, not wanting to disturb the fragile peace. Still, he turned before I spoke, as if sensing me. "You must be the journalist," he said. His voice was rough but kind, the voice of someone who had spent a lifetime speaking more to heaven than to men. "Claire Morin," I introduced myself. He rose slowly to his feet, offering a thin, calloused hand. "Father Pierre, We sat together in one of the front pews, the wood creaking under our weight. For a while, he simply studied me, his gray eyes sharp beneath the folds of age. "You saw them, didn't you?" he said. I nodded. He smiled, a smile touched with sadness. "Not everyone does. Not truly." "What are they?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Father Pierre looked toward the great crucifix above the altar, as if seeking permission to speak. "They are a remembrance," he said, "and a promise." He folded his hands in his lap and began to speak, weaving for me a tapestry of sorrow and hope, of blood and light. Long ago, before Saint Laura became a name on faded maps, it was little more than a scattering of farms and families, bound together by faith and necessity. When persecution swept through the land, the faithful of this valley refused to abandon their masses, their prayers, their hope. They built a small chapel on the island, little more than a hut. Really, where they could gather in secret. By night, they would cross the waters in canoes, muffling their oars with rags, carrying candles wrapped carefully against the damp. They called it the Vigil of the Hidden Flame. Father Pierre said, "A night to remember that even the smallest light can defy the darkness." But darkness was persistent. One night, betrayed by a neighbor desperate for a handful of coins, the soldiers came. They surrounded the island. Father Pierre whispered. There was nowhere to run. He closed his eyes, and for a moment I saw reflected in his lined face the grief of centuries. The faithful did not scream. They did not beg. They lit their candles and raised their voices in hymns that shook the mist and stirred the stars. Even as the soldiers waded into the shallows, even as blades flashed and torches roared, they sang. The waters ran red, and then the storm came. Some say it was coincidence, a squall born of the mountains. Others, like Father Pierre, believed it was a sign. The heavens themselves wept for them. He said, voice trembling, the island was swallowed that night. When dawn broke, nothing remained but open water, and a silence that clung to the valley like a shroud. But they were not forgotten. Father Pierre said, lifting his eyes to meet mine, and once a year, the lake remembers. Later, we walked together through the village. Father Pierre led me down winding alleys, past sagging doorways and shuttered windows, pointing out small signs I would have missed. A carving of a fish on a lintel, a cross stitched into a faded curtain, a rosary tucked into the crack of a stone wall. The faithful left their marks. He said they could not speak openly, so they spoke in symbols, in whispers. We ended up at a low wall overlooking the lake. The mist had lifted slightly, revealing the water's vast, solemn expanse. The stories you will hear, Father Pierre said, they are true in their own way. He told me about the children who spoke of shadowy figures singing by the shore, of the old fisherman who swore he once pulled a waterlogged rosary from his nets, beads still warm as if recently prayed over, of the night a bride vanished into the fog on the eve of her wedding, only for her veil to be found drifting among the candles. The lake remembers, he said again, but memory is a living thing. It touches everyone differently. I listened, heart aching with a strange, bittersweet longing. These were not tales of fear. They were stories of longing, of hope, of a faith that refused to die. "Will you stay for the Mass tonight?" Father Pierre asked. "There is a Mass," I said, surprised. "Always. On the vigil." He smiled. "Even if it is only me and the stones." I promised I would, and as we stood there, the afternoon light thinning into a pale gold, I thought, perhaps it was not just the lake that remembered. Perhaps the stones, the trees, the very air itself, all of it, held the echoes of those who had once knelt here in faith. And perhaps, if I listened closely enough, I could hear them too. Chapter 3. 100 Silent Flames. The evening settled over Saint Laura like a slow, reverent breath. The mist, ever faithful, returned to drape the village in its pale shroud, softening the edges of stone and wood, turning the familiar into something almost dreamlike. As promised, I made my way to the small church at the center of the village, my heart thrumming with quiet anticipation. The bells tolled softly as I arrived, their mournful notes floating across the square like fading prayers. The heavy wooden doors creaked open with a sigh, and I slipped into the dim sanctuary where a handful of villagers were already gathered. Their heads were bowed, their candles unlit, each person a quiet island of reflection. Father Pierre stood at the altar, his hands folded over his heart. He looked older tonight, as if the weight of memory had pressed even more deeply into his bones. His voice, when it rose to begin the Mass, was little more than a whisper, yet somehow it filled every corner of the church. "We gather not in sorrow, but in remembrance," he said, "for those who kept the light alive, even when darkness closed in." The words settled over us like a blessing. I felt their gravity pull at something deep within me, a yearning I hadn't realized I carried. The Mass was simple, stripped of all but the essential. No grand music, no ornate rituals, only prayer, silence, and the soft rustle of the mist outside pressing against the stained glass. When the time came for the lighting of the candles, each villager stepped forward to the altar one by one, taking a flame from the great candle that stood beneath the crucifix. When my turn came, my hands trembled slightly. I cupped the tiny wick carefully, shielding it as I returned to my seat. The flame flickered, its fragile light dancing against the cavernous darkness of the church. After the final prayer, Father Pierre lifted his hand in blessing, and without a word, the villagers began to file out into the night, their candles held before them like small stars. I followed, stepping into the misty air, the scent of damp earth and old stone filling my lungs. We walked slowly, reverently, down the winding path that led to the lake. The world around us had fallen into a silence so profound that even our footsteps seemed to be swallowed by it. As we neared the water's edge, the mist parted slightly, and the lake revealed itself, a sheet of perfect blackness. Smooth and unbroken, the villagers stopped a few feet from the shore, forming a loose crescent. One by one, they knelt, their candles still burning bravely against the night. I stood slightly apart, unsure of what was expected, my breath clouding in the chill air. Then Father Pierre stepped forward. He lifted his candle high, its light casting a small halo around his weathered face. "Remember them," he said softly, "not with sorrow, but with faith." He turned in, with a steady hand, set his candle gently upon the surface of the water. I watched, hardly daring to breathe, as the flame floated, not sinking, not flickering out, but drifting serenely across the lake. One by one, the villagers followed. Each candle placed upon the water floated outward, carried by some unseen current, a procession of light, silent and slow, weaving a tapestry of remembrance across the black mirror of the lake. When my turn came, I hesitated. How could a candle float? How could a flame survive on water? But the others had done it, and their lights still glowed in defiance of logic and fear. I knelt at the shore, the dampness seeping through the fabric of my jeans. With trembling fingers, I set my candle down. It floated. A shudder passed through me, a mixture of awe and something deeper. Something almost like grief. The flame moved away from me, joining the others in their silent voyage. We stood there for a long time, watching. No one spoke, no one moved, and then it began. From the heart of the lake, deeper in the mist, a glow emerged, soft at first, like a heartbeat seen through gauze. I blinked, thinking it must be a trick of the light, a reflection, but no, it grew stronger, brighter, until it became clear. Dozens, hundreds of tiny lights, blooming into being, as if unseen hands had struck invisible matches. Candles, hundreds of them, they moved with the same slow grace as the ones we had set adrift, forming shifting patterns on the water, some grouped together, forming the rough shape of a cross, others stretched out like a winding path leading into the mist. I pressed a hand to my mouth, overwhelmed. The villagers knelt again, their heads bowed. I remained standing, frozen, unable to tear my gaze away. The air around us grew heavy, not with fear, but with something holy. It was as if the lake itself breathed, in and out, carrying the prayers of those long gone. Somewhere beyond the mist, I thought I heard it, a faint melody, like a hymn sung by unseen voices, carried on the still air. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, I could almost see them, the faithful, standing on the vanished island, their faces serene, their hands lifting candles high into the darkness. Tears spilled down my cheeks, not out of sorrow, but out of wonder, out of a deep, aching gratitude for a faith that could burn so brightly. Even in death, when I opened my eyes again, the lights were beginning to fade, one by one, like stars swallowed by the coming dawn. The villagers rose slowly, their movements reverent, and turned back toward the village. Father Pierre waited for me at the edge of the path. "You saw them," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. I nodded, unable to find my voice. "Then you understand," he said, a quiet pride in his voice. I did, more than words could express. That night, as I lay in my small bed in the guest house, the vision of the candles danced behind my closed eyelids. In the world beyond the mist, beyond the clamor and forgetting, something sacred still lived, and somehow I had been allowed to see it. Chapter 4. Dreams of Lucien. The dreams began the very night after the vigil. I lay in bed at the guest house, staring up at the cracked ceiling, the echoes of candlelight still playing behind my closed eyes. Outside, the mist thickened against the window pane, blurring the world into formless shadows. Exhaustion weighed heavy on me, but sleep came hesitantly, like a shy guest unsure whether it was truly welcome. When it finally overtook me, it was not the deep, dreamless slumber I had hoped for. Instead, I found myself standing at the edge of the lake once more. The world around me was not as I had left it. The mist was thicker, glowing faintly with an inner light, and the lake itself seemed to hum, a low vibration that resonated through my bones. The air smelled sweet, almost floral, tinged with the sharpness of wet stone. I turned, searching for some anchor to reality, and that was when I saw him. A boy, no more than 10 years old, stood a few feet away. He wore a white robe that shimmered faintly in the mist, his bare feet barely making a sound on the damp earth. His face was pale but serene, framed by dark curls that clung to his forehead. In his hands, he held a candle. It burned steadily, casting a gentle halo around him. He looked at me with eyes that seemed far older than his years, eyes that had seen too much, carried too much, and yet still held a peace I could not comprehend. He smiled, a small, almost shy curve of his lips, and then he turned, walking slowly along the shoreline. Without thinking, I followed. We walked in silence, the only sound the faint lapping of water against stone. I wanted to speak, to ask who he was, but something in the stillness of the moment held me back. The boy led me to a place where the mist parted slightly, revealing a fragment of crumbling stone jutting from the water, the last remnant of the island that had once been. He knelt there, setting his candle on the worn rock. The flame flickered, then steadied, casting long, wavering shadows across the water. He turned to me then, his face solemn. "Remember," he said, his voice a whisper barely louder than the mist itself. I woke with a start, heart pounding, the image of the boy and his candle seared into my mind. The next night, the dream returned. This time, the boy was waiting at the edge of the woods, where the ancient trees leaned over the path like silent sentinels. His candle was already lit, and as I approached, he held it out to me. I hesitated, then reached for it. Our hands brushed, and a jolt of warmth shot up my arm, not the heat of fire, but something deeper, something alive. When I took the candle, the mist around us seemed to pulse, and for a moment, I thought I heard singing, a chorus of voices, distant but clear, weaving a melody that tugged at my soul. The boy smiled again, that same quiet, knowing smile, and pointed toward the lake. The path ahead was lined with more candles now, flickering in the gloom, leading toward the water. I followed, the candle in my hand lighting the way. When I reached the shore, I saw the others, figures draped in simple robes, their faces hidden in shadow, each holding a candle. They stood in a wide circle, their flames reflecting in the still water, creating the illusion of a galaxy floating just above the surface. The boy stepped into the center of the circle and knelt, placing his candle at the heart of the constellation. The others followed, one by one, until the lake was ringed with light. Then, as one, they began to sing. It was not a song I knew, yet its melody was achingly familiar, as if it had been stitched into the fabric of my soul long before I had words to name it. I woke again, tears streaming down my face, the echoes of the hymn fading into the morning light. During the day, I could not shake the dreams. They lingered at the edges of my vision, slipping into every idle moment. I wandered the village in a daze, seeking something I could not name. At the cafe, Elise watched me with a mixture of concern and understanding. "You saw him," she said one afternoon, setting a steaming cup of coffee before me. "Who?" I asked, though I already knew. "Lucien," she said simply, "the boy who would not let the light die." She told me then of the youngest among the faithful who had perished on the island. A boy named Lucien, barely 10 years old, who had insisted on carrying the largest candle during the final vigil. They say it was his singing that rose above the others when the soldiers came. Elise said, her voice trembling slightly, a voice so pure, so brave, that even the cruelest heart among them faltered. I clutched the coffee cup, my hands trembling. "Why is he appearing to me?" I whispered. Elise shook her head. "Perhaps because you are willing to see." That night, I returned to the lake alone. The mist was thicker than ever, swirling around me in dense, ghostly tendrils. I carried no candle, yet the path before me glowed faintly, as if the very ground remembered the footsteps of those who had come before. I knelt at the water's edge, the stones cold and slick beneath my knees. "Lucien," I whispered into the mist. "I am here." For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, from the heart of the lake, a single light bloomed. It floated toward me, slow and steady, until I could see it clearly. A candle, cradled by invisible hands. I reached out, and as my fingers brushed the flame, a warmth unlike anything I had ever known flooded through me. Not heat, but love, pure and vast and overwhelming. In that moment, I understood. Lucien had not appeared to me to frighten or confuse. He had come to remind me, and perhaps to remind all who would listen, that faith endures. That even in the darkest night, a single light can change everything. I closed my eyes, letting the warmth seep into every corner of my soul. When I opened them again, the candle was gone, the mist swirling once more across the lake. But within me, a new flame had been lit, one that no darkness could ever extinguish. Chapter 5. Echoes of 1783. The morning after my encounter at the lake, I awoke with a singular purpose burning in my chest. I needed to understand the dreams, the lights, the boy named Lucien. They weren't figments of imagination. They were threads, delicate and persistent, pulling me towards something much older than myself. I started at the village library, a small stone building nestled between the cafe and the old bakery. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of aging paper and beeswax polish. Rows of battered wooden shelves sagged under the weight of ancient tomes, their spines faded to near illegibility. Elise had told me that if there were any records left, they would be here. The librarian, an elderly man named Monsieur Renard, peered at me over thick glasses as I explained my quest. "You seek the martyrs," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Few bother to remember them now, but they should be remembered," I replied, surprising myself with the fierceness in my voice. Monsieur Renard studied me for a long moment, then nodded. He led me to a locked cabinet near the back of the library. Retrieving an iron key from a chain around his neck, "Be gentle," he said as he turned the lock. "These are the last whispers of those who came before." Inside the cabinet were several fragile volumes, each wrapped carefully in linen. Monsieur Renard lifted one out and placed it on a reading table. "This," he said, "is the ledger of the vigil." My hands shook slightly as I opened the cover. The parchment pages crackled like brittle leaves, and the ink had faded to a ghostly brown. The first page bore a simple inscription, "In memory of those who kept the light." The ledger was not merely a list of names. It was a tapestry of lives, births, baptisms, marriages, woven together by a common faith and an unshakable courage. I learned that in 1783, a wave of violent persecution had swept through the region, driven by political unrest and a growing suspicion of the Church. In Saint Elora, a small group of believers had refused to renounce their faith. They had hidden in the woods by day and crossed the lake by night, gathering on the small island to hold Mass and pray together in secret. Their gatherings were known only by a few, protected by the silence and loyalty of the villagers. At the heart of this group was a young priest named Father Gabriel Lemoyne. Ordained in secret, he had dedicated his life to tending the spiritual needs of the hidden flock. Alongside him were families, farmers, fishermen, and children, ordinary people drawn together by extraordinary conviction. Among them was Lucien. A page near the center of the ledger was dedicated to him, Lucien Moreau. Aged 10 years, keeper of the vigil flame. My throat tightened as I traced the faded words with my fingertip. The final entries were hurried, the handwriting frantic. "They have found us. We will not run. We will pray. We will sing. We will trust in the light." No dates followed, only a smear of ink where the quill had faltered. I closed the ledger gently, bowing my head over it in silent reverence. Determined to learn more, I spent the following days speaking with the oldest villagers, piecing together fragments of stories handed down through generations. There was Madame Fournier, who remembered her grandmother speaking of the night of the singing flames, when the sky itself seemed to shudder with sorrow. There was old Pierre Mathieu, who swore that his great-uncle had once seen ghostly processions crossing the lake in the dead of night. Each story added a layer of color to the tapestry, deepening my understanding. Yet it was not until I spoke with Father Pierre again that the final pieces fell into place. We sat in the church, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows through the stained glass windows. "You have seen them," he said quietly. "Now you must know them." He retrieved a battered journal from beneath the altar, Father Gabriel's personal diary. Preserved through centuries of quiet guardianship, the pages told a story more intimate than any ledger or whispered legend. Father Gabriel wrote of the fear they lived with daily, of the hunger and the cold. But he also wrote of the unbreakable spirit that bound them. He wrote of Lucien, the boy who had become a beacon of hope among them. When despair threatens, Gabriel wrote, "We look to the boy who sings. His voice carries our prayers higher than we alone could send them." Gabriel described the final night in heartbreaking detail, how they had gathered for what they knew might be their last Mass, how they had lit their candles and sung with all the strength left in their bodies, how Lucien had stood in the center, holding the great candle aloft, singing even as the soldiers closed in, It was as if the heavens themselves opened to receive him. Gabriel wrote, and in that moment, we were not afraid. As I finished reading, I wept, not just for the lives lost, but for the incredible beauty of their faith, a beauty that refused to be extinguished by violence or time. Father Pierre placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. Their story lives on because you have seen it, he said, and because you are willing to carry it. I nodded, unable to speak. Outside, the mist was gathering once more over the lake, swirling in soft spirals that caught the dying light. Somewhere beyond the veil, I felt them, the faithful, the martyrs, the keepers of the flame. And in my heart, I promised them I would remember. I would carry their light forward into a world that so often forgets. The next morning, before the village stirred, I returned to the shore. I lit a single candle and set it on the water. It floated out into the mist, a tiny, stubborn star, and as it drifted away, I whispered a prayer, not just for them, but for all of us who must keep the flame alive. Chapter 6. The Storm and the Miracle of the Flames. The weather began to change the morning after my prayer by the lake. Heavy clouds, dark as slate, gathered on the horizon, and the air grew heavy with the scent of rain and something else, something electric. Like the hum of unseen wings stirring, villagers moved quietly through the streets, their eyes wary, their hands swift. Even the old bells of the church seemed to ring differently, their tones dampened by the thickening mist. Elise met me at the cafe that morning, her face lined with concern. "A storm is coming," she said, "a strong one. Is it unusual for this time of year?" I asked. She hesitated, glancing toward the lake. "It comes, when it comes." There was something in her voice, an unspoken understanding that this was no ordinary weather. I felt it too, a trembling just beneath the skin of the world, as if the earth itself was bracing for something more than rain. By late afternoon, the sky had turned a sickly greenish gray, and the first low growls of thunder rolled across the hills. The villagers shuttered their windows and bolted their doors. Candles appeared in every window, small beacons against the rising gloom. I found myself drawn back to the church. Inside, Father Pierre knelt at the altar, his head bowed, his hands folded tightly together. The great candle beneath the crucifix burned steadily, its flame barely flickering despite the rising wind that moaned against the stone walls. I joined him silently, sinking to my knees on the cold stone floor. We prayed, not with elaborate words or grand gestures, just simple, fervent prayers whispered from the depths of the heart. Outside, the storm broke. Lightning ripped the sky in jagged, furious strokes. Thunder cracked and rumbled, shaking the very bones of the earth. The rain came in sheets, battering the village, turning the narrow streets into rivulets. Yet inside the church, there was a strange peace. The candlelight seemed to grow stronger, not weaker. The shadows it cast danced along the walls. And for a moment, I thought I saw figures moving there, tall and slender, clothed in robes of mist and light. I blinked, and they were gone, but the sense of presence remained. As night fell, the storm reached its peak. The village seemed to crouch under the onslaught, every door and shutter straining against the wind. The bells in the church tower swung wildly, their desperate clangor swallowed by the roar of the tempest. It was then that I heard it, a faint singing, barely audible beneath the howling of the wind. I rose and moved toward the church doors, heart pounding. Father Pierre caught my arm, his eyes wide. "You must not go," he said urgently. "I have to," I whispered. He released me with a reluctant nod, and together we pushed open the heavy doors. The rain lashed against us, cold and punishing. The world beyond was a maelstrom of darkness and water, but through it, I could see small, stubborn points of light moving toward the lake. Candles, dozens of them. I stumbled forward, shielding my face against the storm. Father Pierre followed, his robes whipping around him like wings. The candles moved steadily, untouched by the wind and rain, as if borne by invisible hands. Villagers began to emerge from their homes. Drawn by the impossible sight, they gathered silently at the edges of the square, their faces upturned, their mouths open in wonder. Together, we watched as the lights made their way to the shore. There, at the edge of the furious, frothing lake, the candles floated upward, not outward onto the water, but upward into the air. They rose slowly, like stars freed from the weight of the world. One by one, they formed a great, shining cross above the lake, its arms stretching wide against the black, storm-torn sky, and in the midst of the cross, I saw him, Lucien. His small figure shone with a light not of this world. He held his great candle high, and from his lips, though the roar of the storm still raged, came the pure, unwavering thread of song. I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my face. Around me, the villagers knelt as well, their heads bowed in awe. The cross of light hovered there for what felt like an eternity, defying wind, rain, and reason itself. Then, slowly, gently, it began to drift upward, disappearing into the storm clouds, leaving behind only the memory of its brilliance and the lingering echo of a child's song. The storm broke soon after. The rain ceased, the wind died, the mist lifted. The village emerged into a night so clear, so still, it felt like stepping into another world. Stars blazed overhead, fierce and bright. We rose slowly, wiping our faces, looking at one another with new eyes. No words were needed. We had all seen. We had all been part of something holy. Father Pierre turned to me, his face wet with tears and rain. "You must tell their story," he said. I nodded, my heart full to overflowing. That night, as I sat by my window, the candle I had lit earlier still burned steadily beside me. And outside, over the lake, a single point of light remained, a reminder, a promise, a flame that no storm could ever snuff out. It was the miracle of the faithful, the miracle of 1783, and it would burn forever. Chapter 7. Rekindling the Flame. The morning after the storm, the world seemed reborn. The mist had lifted, leaving the village bathed in a clarity so pure it made everything look touched by grace. The cobblestones gleamed with yesterday's rain. The flowers in the window boxes seemed to nod gently at the soft breeze. There was a peace, a deep stillness, as if all of Saint Laura was holding its breath in quiet awe. And inside me, something had shifted. For so long, I had lived with questions, with doubts, with a faith cracked and faded by the noise of the world. I had come to Saint Laura chasing a story. I never imagined it would be my own heart that would be changed. I sat in the guest house that morning, a blank notebook open before me, the first rays of sunlight spilling across the page. My pen hovered above the paper, trembling with the weight of everything I needed to say. I began to write, not just the story of the candles, or the storm, or the boy named Lucien. I wrote about courage, about hope, about a faith that refused to die, even when faced with the greatest darkness. I wrote for those who had come before, the ones who had knelt in prayer while the world crumbled around them, who had lit candles with trembling hands and sung songs against the roaring void. And I wrote for those yet to come, for the hearts that might one day doubt as I had doubted, who would need to know that even in the coldest night, there had once been light. Each day, I walked the village, speaking with those who would speak to me. The old and the young alike shared their memories, their dreams, their whispered legends. Madame Fournier pressed a faded handkerchief into my palm, embroidered with a tiny cross, telling me it had belonged to her great-grandmother, who had witnessed the night of the singing flames. Pierre Mathieu showed me an old iron key, said to have belonged to the door of the island chapel, long since swallowed by the lake. Even Elise, quiet and reserved, opened her heart, sharing a yellowed letter from an ancestor, speaking of faith carried in the marrow of our bones, in the breath we pass on. Every story, every artifact was another thread in the tapestry, and every thread carried the weight of generations who had refused to let the flame be extinguished. I spent hours in the church, sitting beneath the ancient crucifix, letting the quiet wrap around me. Sometimes I lit a candle, sometimes I simply sat in silence, listening. It was there, in that sacred hush, that the story began to weave itself into something greater than a record of events. It became a testament, not just to a group of forgotten villagers from 1783, but to the enduring power of belief, to the way light can ripple outward, touching lives unseen, kindling hope in places far from where the first flame was lit. Father Pierre encouraged me gently, offering stories of his own, smiling when I confessed my fears of not doing justice to what I had witnessed. "You were chosen to see," he said one evening as we watched the sunset paint the lake in molten gold. "That means you are also chosen to tell." His words anchored me. They became a prayer I whispered to myself each time the doubts returned. "You were chosen to see. You are chosen to tell." And so I wrote, pages and pages, filling notebooks until my hand ached, until my heart felt wrung out and whole all at once. I did not polish the words too much. I let them remain rough, raw, honest, because the story of the faithful was not a polished thing. It was weathered and worn, like the stones of the church, like the hands of the villagers who still knelt in prayer by the lakeside. It was real, and real things carry their own kind of beauty. On the last evening before I was to leave Saint Laura, the villagers gathered once more at the lake shore. No one had spoken of it beforehand. No invitations had been sent. And yet, as the sun sank low and the first stars pricked the sky, the people came. Candles were lit, one by one, until the shoreline glowed with hundreds of tiny flames. I stood among them, my own candle flickering in my hands. Father Pierre stepped forward and raised his voice, not shouting, but speaking with a deep, resonant certainty. "We remember." The villagers echoed softly, "We remember." He turned to me then and nodded. It was my turn. Hands trembling, heart pounding, I stepped forward and I read from the pages I had written. I told the story, their story, of courage, of faith, of a light that had never truly gone out. My voice wavered at times, but it did not fail. The words floated out across the water, carried by the night breeze, mingling with the light of the candles, with the prayers of the living and the unseen. When I finished, there was no applause, only silence, deep and reverent, the kind of silence that says more than any words ever could. That night, long after the candles had burned low and the villagers had returned to their homes, I sat by the lake alone. The stars shimmered above, and somewhere across the water, a faint glimmer still danced. I closed my eyes, breathing in the cool, sacred air. I thought of Lucien, of Father Gabriel, of all those whose names might never be known but whose light still burned, carried forward in the hearts of those willing to believe. I made a vow then, as solemn and fierce as any I had ever spoken. I would carry their story, I would bear their light, and wherever I went, whatever shadows might come, I would remember. Faith endures, light endures, and sometimes, if we are very lucky, we are chosen to see and chosen to tell, just as I had been. As the last light dances over the still waters of Saint Laura, I am reminded of the words spoken long ago. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. John chapter 1 verse 5. Through every storm, every shadow, every silence, the flame of faith endures. It flickers, it trembles, but it never dies, because it lives not only in places, but in hearts willing to believe. Thank you, dear friend, for walking this journey with me. May you carry a little of this light within you, wherever your own path may lead. Until we meet again, may the quiet miracles find you, and may you always have the courage to see them. Goodbye for now, and see you in the next story.